webinar on pivot tables, a very esoteric, specific thing. I can only imagine that everyone that enrolled is already familiar. I am going to go through them rather surface level for those of you that might not be and might want to just have an introduction to them inside the BeyondPay system, but certainly have to fit a lot into the half-hour allotment, and we'll stick on the surface and give a few examples. My name is Graham Watts. I'm the Director of Operations here at BeyondPay. I am happy to show anything data related and anything within the BeyondPay system. So with that, with no further ado, you should be seeing a BeyondPay screen, and you'll notice that there are charts and graphs on there. And this lends itself to the ever-evolving software that is BeyondPay. It continues to change, and while underneath much of the processes are unchanged for you guys, it is very much an evolving high-tech platform that beats and competes and keeps up with all other software platforms. And to have data like this at your fingertips, charts and graphs, it's very useful. And to go one level deeper is pivot tables. Much like having an Excel spreadsheet, the ability to then manipulate into a pivot table can give you quick, ready access to data you may be looking for. So let me jump right into there. And the question is, what's the best use case for a pivot table? And the best use case is when you have a lot of data and you want to comb through it and filter it quickly and make it tell you what you want to know. So those of you familiar with the labor distribution report, it is one of the strongest, most robust reports that BeyondPay has. And while it's loading, I'll explain that to you. What it does is it itemizes every dollar, every detail of a payroll, a span of time, and you can break it into as many lines as you want. So if you're looking at the screen now, this is just a labor distribution detail for a year's worth of time, and it's pushing out 8,000 rows of data. Awesome. I love metadata. You can then start to filter, you can export, you can look for what you're looking for. And that would be the old way I would have loved to show this report. As you drop columns, it will shrink in size. For example, if I were to delete the column that is last name, first name, it would drop from 8,000 rows to probably 2,000 rows. As soon as you're no longer asking it to give you employee detail, it will self-compress. So, but you would have to remove that column, and if you wanted it back again, you would have to bring it back again. Rather, and it's also saving multiple views, rather you can do just like a spreadsheet, you can add a pivot table. So what I've navigated to is a saved report. You do have to have a saved version of your own report. And in here, you'll notice a new button in the upper right-hand corner you've not noticed before, and that is below the bell with the red 5 is the pivot table icon. Once clicked, if you're familiar with pivot tables, it will show you what is very similar to the old-fashioned, the Windows version, because you can toggle if you're familiar with Excel, with the older original version of what a pivot table would look like. Still one of my favorites, still the one I use to teach people on, and that's why it's good to have it here, and I'll demonstrate here. So what we have is the beginning of a pivot table. And if you follow along from kind of top and left of any chart you want to use, you'll see columns. Filters will always be the top left. That's kind of like in Excel, the space between A and 1, that's the whole filter column. But your columns are on the top, your rows are on the left, and then what you're looking for, your values are on the right. So I'll do a very simple one for now. And again, keeping in mind that we had 8,000 rows of data, 8,000 rows of metadata. I'm going to just drop department into rows, and I'm going to drop amount into values. As soon as I hit apply, now we have 30 rows. It automatically did a subtotal based on the criteria I gave it. What is the total amount for this criteria department? Let me make this a little bigger. Oh, sorry, wrong option. It'll just look nicer to fill up the screen. So rather than having to drop columns, save a view, add columns, maybe I want more detail than this. Right now, we're only looking at one of our cost centers, totals by department. Maybe now I want to bring in this secondary cost center that we're using, job. As soon as I drop that below department, and order does matter, looks like similar data, but it automatically insets the sub-departments, the subcategory you asked for, department and job. So the picking administrative managers, by the way, the $289,000 is broken up between these two subcategories. Also inside of here, perhaps you want to filter the data, because right now I'm grabbing everything, taxes, earnings, everything. That's being broken out by this item here, earning and deduction type, which I just brought in by accident. So if I were to drop that into here, and I will also put line type into report filters. This will be the first time I'm using report filters. You notice I put it in the top left. I'll apply for now to show you what I did. And as a matter of fact, for purposes of showing you, I'm going to remove job. You'll notice I just drag them off. Now what I have is a subtotal of everything that made up that data. Instead of stratifying administration by its subdepartment, I'm now stratifying it by the earnings and deductions. A lot of data, but it's everything that made up administration. Perhaps all you wanted to see was the earnings. That line type now appears up below the Save View As. And this is where you can unselect all and only push the earnings, hit apply, and it will flow itself to just showing you the regular and the salary. Just the earnings are now being applied to this criteria. So then, right now, it's basically looking like a subtotaled version of very many other reports. One of the neat items for this, and it's a common request for BeyondPay clients, is something like an earning record. Something where you have everything for an employee arrayed right to left rather than stacked. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm now going to take the earning deduction name, and instead of rows, I'm going to put it in columns. Once I hit apply, instead of each of the earnings being nested below the criteria, it's nested to the right. And what's neat about this with all pivot tables is you don't need to know what you were looking for. With certain reports like the pay statement history report or many of our reports, you could have brought in a column for bonus, double time, FFCRA, but you need to know which column you wanted and then bring them in one by one. And you wouldn't want to grab columns you haven't used in a few years. Maybe you had triple time for a special job one time. You don't need to bring in that triple time earning if you know you haven't used it for years. If you were bringing all earnings, you would have a ton of columns you just didn't need because they weren't used. But a pivot table will only grab what was in the report and array it for you. You don't have to know, it just arrays it for you. And right now I have it broken out by department, just to finish the thought. This report, that if I drop that and bring in the employee last name, first name into rows, and instead of arraying the data by department, it'll array it by person. This report that you're looking at is very commonly requested. It's called an earning record or an earning report. And it doesn't have to just be the earnings. I'm currently filtering for that. But you could bring every item for the person in, apply it, and it will run left to right. It's basically inverting the selection of what the labor distribution detail was showing. Instead of putting it all down, it's putting it all sideways. Let me compress that back down for the next demonstration. And I would actually like to show back to the department. So I'll return it back to its just department by earnings. Let me remove that as well. All we're going to look at for now is department earnings. This looking for a practical use case of how this may work. This is just your earning and maybe your employer tax expense and your employer deduction. So I'm going to grab everything that is an expense item by cost center. So here we see for the year's time which each item drove, what each cost center drove. But what's also neat about cost centers, about pivot tables, is you can have two versions of the same element doing two different math functions. So for example, I've brought in sum of amount twice, but rather than having the sum of the amount, I can have it be a percent of the total. assuming my mouse will cooperate. No, sorry, I selected the wrong option. So what I've done here is very quickly, without having to create a formula and copy it down, you can now see what percent of the entire data set you've requested. It shows you both the earning but the expense, as well as what percent of that, of the total for the company was driven by that cost center. And that becomes particularly more useful when you start dividing by two different criteria. So right now, we're only looking at department. By inserting the job below the department, now this is where the details matter. I subdivided administration by the sub-departments that drove administration, administration accounting, administration customer service. But because of the type of percentage I grabbed, it's telling you for these two subsets what percent of the company total. So only 3% of the entire report was driven by accounting in the admin department. You can also make it tell you what percent of admin itself was accounting. Hopefully that wasn't too quick. I can perhaps just show it to you. Oh, again, the wrong one. Percent of parent row total. Here we go. So now, rather than it showing you that accounting was 3% of the entire company, accounting as it applied to administration, now it's showing you that accounting was 32% of administration itself. And you can still see that administration drove almost 10% of the company. And then inside of administration, 32% of that 9% was for accounting. Another neat function of pivot tables and the ability to change on the fly is the ability to reference the subtotals. I guess that's what I should have started with. The ability to reference subtotals and use them for data is something you would typically have to extract to Excel and use formulas for. But rather than do that, you can make the pivot table do it for you. So for example, I'm going to just bring in a simple month. I have on our source data, I have a unique identifier for just month. And right now it's just saying what was my total expenses for each month. It's just finding the payroll date, isolating the month, and self-creating a subtotal for it. So here you can see how much was spent each month regardless of department for now. Inside of this, I can again bring the same data element, sum of amount, and rather than do a percent this time, what this is, I brought in difference of column. It's the same thing, it's the amount, but what it's doing, it's referencing the line above it. So you can see that in February, we spent $12,000 more than in January. But then it'll always reference the one above it, but then it dropped by 29,000 February over March. So this is a good couple click way to show month over month change, again, without having to export to Excel, create formulas, and usually just isolate the subtotals. And once you have what you're looking at, you can again begin to just drag and drop the criteria you're looking for inside of that month. So here you can see, actually did in the wrong order. For pivot tables, order matters. I'm referenced back to the pencil in the top corner. You'll notice that I have month above department. So it's giving me month and then trying to subtotal by department. What I wanted was department by month. You simply drag month below department, and now it will show me what I was looking for, which is within administration, what I spent in January with the change over to February. And you'll notice that we spent $200 more. That's a nice clean look with $14,000. So you see the increase of $200 into February, but then a significant drop of $1,000 into March. So it's giving you the same data elements within whatever criteria you picked. And very similar to a pivot table, you can change the layout of what you're looking for on your screen. You'll notice that it automatically compresses, much like subtotals on a spreadsheet. But inside are the layout options for those of you familiar. And you can go to the classic form. You can change the format of the pivot table itself, and it will just break out into separate columns what was automatically nesting. I'll just leave it on the screen for a moment. You can turn on and off the subtotals. Go to flat. And this would be one of my, this is actually bringing us all the way back to the raw data that was the LD profile. So it's kind of circular to have put it into this format. So I'll just go back to the compact form, which is kind of the cleanest, easiest way to diagnose. And the last thing I'd like to show for this particular training, the ability to diagnose a pivot table and teach people how to use pivot tables, I could wax poetic for hours. But the really best part to show about a pivot table is you can't go wrong because you didn't change your source data. And as long as you didn't save it, it's just a click away from dragging and dropping the order for yourself. But if you do want to save it, much like any report in Beyond Pay, just save it, and then it will be retained inside of Beyond Pay for you. You can have multiple versions of pivot tables, or you can have just one and move your sliders around. And if I were to say view report data, it's going to jump me back to the labor distribution report that I started with. And I didn't have to delete any lines. I didn't have to sort it. I didn't have to filter it. So your source data stays what it is. So my use of this pivot table would be that I would have this saved, a labor distribution detail report with no filters on it for this year running. I already have my month, which will auto-populate as soon as December turns into January. Well, bad example. As soon as November turns to December, this thing will auto-create itself. Every time a payroll runs, it'll add any earnings or deductions that weren't used before. You don't need to select those columns, and it will go to 8,900 rows. It'll just be metadata that you don't then have to worry about taking the time to filter. You would just navigate to this saved view, click on the pivot table, and I should have saved one for demonstration purposes. You can even have your saved pivot table for you, and you don't need to re-drag and drop. It'll just be there. But if you have a question, a business question or a business need to get information, maybe all you wanted was the job this time. Maybe for your purposes, you don't need to know anything but the job earnings or who got a bonus and by what job. You can start to throw the data elements in. I put the earning name up into filters, the job into rows, and the amount into values. So in the filter, I can just navigate to bonus. I pushed too much data here. I should have picked a less. We'll do 403B for now. So it automatically tells you, oh, perhaps cost centers isn't what you wanted for your 403B. You want to know who got it. One person. So but that quickly, I can answer a question for who's receiving 403B without having to run the filter. And that's not as good a use case as under which department, where did my expenses get driven from. I'm going to put department, then name, then earning type. I'm going to inline filter. It's right now currently being inline filtered because I moved an item that was already being filtered. And now you can see who drove inside of administration. Kelly Clarkson drove this expense. You can further drill down to what drove that expense. And finally, I will put the line type. Again, order matters. Line type above the earning type. And inside of administration, we can see that what Kelly Clarkson drove, and then I can drop in what percent and follow it from there. So with that, I will leave time for questions and answers. I don't know necessarily that we can cover all of the options other than to say it is a pivot table built into BeyondPay. The ideas of how to use it are as wide open as what kind of data do you quickly need, and perhaps somebody has some use cases they would like to put into the Q&A or any other questions they would like to ask.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Graham. I think you covered everything for a first look. Not seeing any questions come in just yet.
Oh, I actually have one from Lisa.
Great.
Is there a way to develop these reports and then share them with our managers on their dashboards? You can absolutely share the reports. I quite honestly haven't tried yet pushing a pivot table to the dashboard. I can certainly take that question for you and get back to you. I'm going to guess the answer is yes, because they function exactly as charts, and charts can be pushed to the dashboard. So very similar to the chart, we'll push the pivot table there as well. But that being said, I will take that question and circle back to you.
Perfect.
You're welcome.
Okay, I think that is all for today then. Like we said earlier, this was recorded, so we'll be sending out that to your inboxes directly, and you can forward this to anyone that you'd like to share. But thank you all for giving us your attention for the afternoon, and thank you, Graham, for helping us and showing this out today.
You're welcome, and thank you. It's a lot of information. Please feel free to reach out to your customer service rep for more information and play the recording. And I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.